that was a card I didn't really want to play in the deck, so it ends up buying you at least a turn a lot of the times. Playing around Flutter Mane is one of the most important parts of the matchup.
What do you think about dealing with items?
Your prizes in the endgame actually do end up getting fairly awkward with the deck, so you don't always want to go in for the early Framer attack, and at that point the game's probably over for them.
When are you thinking about playing around Unfair Stamp in a matchup like this?
Whenever I've had success with Lost Box list, usually.
If you're not already aware, Andrew Hedrick just won our largest tournament ever with Lost Zone Box, and he's also ranked 2 in the entire world. So today, I got him on the channel to teach us everything he knows about Lost Zone Box. He talks about possible Lost Zone decklist choices, as well as his experience with every single matchup in the format. Hope you enjoy. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Lost Zone deck list. So the first thing I want to ask you is sort of like the split versions of Lost Zone. So obviously you played the version that's on screen here with like the high lightning energies. But the other version that sort of other people ran at the event is the Roaring Moon version. That's like sort of the way it's split. You either run like this version or like the Dark Energy. What do you think about running Roaring Moon in Lost Zone?
Yeah, so Roaring Moon is obviously an extremely strong attacker, and it's something that I considered playing in the deck too. Being able to just knock out your opponent's active, whatever it is. Something with high HP especially is a very useful thing to have in the deck. But the one problem with Roaring Moon is that it takes up some extra deck spaces. You have to cut into your energy count, as well as like cut a different card for energy, because you need at least 3 dark energy to be able to reasonably use it, as well as find a space for the Roaring Moon. So you definitely lose access to some spaces in your deck, and that kind of like was devoted to more turbo cards in my deck with the 3 Lost Vacuums, the 4 Pokestops, stuff like that. So it's kind of a trade-off. You have to decide if it is worth playing the Roaring Moon or not. You have to cut into your other spaces to have that extra option, which is a pretty strong option to have, but I wanted to make sure I was getting to those turn 2 Mirage Gate plays, potentially Lugia turn 2 Sableye plays, and if you're dedicating more spaces to Roaring Moon, it's harder to get to those type of plays.
Yeah, and like what matchups do you think you like, if you say you were considering Roaring Moon, what matchups, if you were like expecting more of, would you actually like properly consider running more Roaring Moon? Like the Zard matchup, the pull matchups, like the matchups with like these sort of like high health attackers, if they were like more common in the future, or more common, would you play Roaring Moon, or still probably go in this direction?
So I think like one of the biggest arguments to consider putting Roaring Moon in your deck is to expect a resurgence in Charizard, and especially if they're including the Jirachi. I think that my deck is fighting against Charizard that doesn't play Jirachi, and I expected if I hit any NAIC, they would not have the Jirachi, and I did hit one and he didn't have Jirachi, and I was able to win, utilizing stuff like the Sableye and just knocking out the Pidgeot. And then you can kind of deal with one Charizard at the end, maybe with a combination of some chip damage and then Ursaluna to knock it out is like one option to close out the game. But if they are playing the Jirachi, it becomes a lot harder to take advantage of those low HP Pokemon on the bench with something like the Sableye, and then you kind of end up having to either have a little bit slower of a game, or if you had the Roaring Moon, you could still force the knockouts on their active and probably win the prize trade that way. So it's definitely a more difficult match if you don't have access to the Roaring Moon, especially if they have the Jirachi. And so if that's something that becomes more common, I would definitely consider playing Roaring Moon. And additionally, the Dragapult matchup, Roaring Moon can definitely be useful, and if they get to like a lone Dragapult type of board state.
Okay, fair. The next thing I want to ask you about is Manaphy. So obviously there's like some pretty obvious reasons to run Manaphy, the Lost Zone matchup, and Chien Pao. So what do you think about Manaphy? You think it's worth running it? Obviously you didn't run it, but what do you think about it?
Yes, I didn't play it, and one of my friends who played the deck, and he got top 8 as well, Andrew Hedrick, he did play the Manaphy, and he said that it wasn't too useful for him. So I feel pretty good about that decision into not playing it. Obviously it can be helpful in the Lost Zone mirror, although I do feel like Roxanne is still a much more important card to determine the outcome of the games than something like the Manaphy. Because even if they do take the extra prizes with the Greninja at the beginning, you can kind of limit the number of small things you put on your board, and then utilize stuff like Roxanne, and kind of just try to make it come back that way anyway. And stuff like the Chien Pao, I think is already probably a slightly favored matchup in my opinion. I don't think that matchup's a huge concern. Obviously playing the Manaphy would make it a lot better, although they could still take the early prize trade with an Iron Hand if you weren't able to put the pressure on them. Definitely would improve that matchup, but overall I don't think it's worth it for 2 matchups that aren't like super high percent of the meta, and when I think you could devote more space to consistency.
Yeah, fair. Makes a lot of sense. I don't really have much more to ask you about Manaphy. I was sort of wanted you to run down these, like the consistency spots you put in this deck list, things that weren't really as common in the event. Like definitely like third vacuum and Pokestop. Weren't common at all. And yeah, something like Roxanne as well was fairly common, but what do you think about sort of just run down your reasoning for running these cards?
Yeah, so I'll start with Pokestop. 4 is definitely something that I don't think I really saw anyone playing before the event.
Yeah.
I initially had 3. I kind of just wanted to build a Turbo Lost Box list, but then I kind of saw Pokestop was really useful. I was pretty upset when I didn't have one in my opening hand. I was always thinking I wanted more of this card, or if you were Lost Zoning them with the Lost Vacuums to build up your Lost Zone, then you wouldn't have enough for the end game potentially. So just having 4 Pokestops made it so you had access to it very commonly throughout the game, and it was extremely strong, which kind of came into the deck after I cut the Forest Seal Stone. Because I initially had the Raikou Forest Seal Stone package in the deck, but as that got moved away from, then I decided that still want the 5th vacuum target to make sure we can get enough cards in the Lost Zone with our Lost Vacuums, and it's extremely strong to have access to Pokestop every turn throughout the game, especially with potentially vacuuming your Pokestop and then using another one in the same turn, getting to see 6 extra cards to find those things like the Mirage Gates, the Nest Balls type of things that you might need. So overall, that's very strong to have in the deck. And then the 3 Lost Vacuums just really helps you build up your Lost Zone extremely quickly, potentially even threaten turn 2 Lost Mine plays. I was able to do that against the Charizard I hit and just completely destroyed his board, and he just instantly conceded, which is definitely something really strong to threaten, as well as just making sure you can get to the turn 2 Mirage Gate plays, even without having a bunch of access to a bunch of comfies. It just adds so much extra like options to the deck in terms of being able to build up your Lost Zone extremely quickly, even potentially threatening turn 1 attack, which I was able to do a couple of times throughout the event. And then I would say for Roxanne, that was a card I didn't really want to play in the deck, but my friends kind of convinced me that it was probably worth playing, and it was definitely useful a few times throughout the event. And it's one of those things where if your opponents end up figuring out you don't have access to it, they can play completely differently, and that was kind of something I was worried about. As I got near the end of the tournament and my opponents knew I didn't have Roxanne, they wouldn't have to play around hand disruption at all, and they would kind of just be able to hold whatever they needed to close out the game in the hand. So it was a card I ended up deciding it was probably worth including in the deck.
Okay, fair. I think that makes a lot of sense. The next card I want to talk about is Iron Thorns. Definitely was uncommon before the event. It's picked up a lot now. Yeah, so obviously it's a tech for Lugia. What do you think about Iron Thorns? Like, there were some people running Temple and Enhanced Hammer at the event. Definitely Enhanced Hammer was least common, but like other sort of techs for Lugia. Do you think a tech for Lugia is necessary in general? And yeah, what do you think about Thorns?
Yeah, so I think it was really good for the event, with Lugia ended up being the most played deck in day 1, and that was kind of something that I thought was definitely fairly likely to happen. Additionally, I just started with the Raikou instead of the Iron Thorns, but I was kind of finding that the Lugia matchup could be pretty tough if they were able to go first. It was pretty hard to hit the turn 1 attack, not going to happen too much, and they got the Summoning Star off. The game kind of just like ended at that point. If they took the first 2 prizes, they could just kind of put you in a prize trade where it was pretty much impossible for you to win. But with the Iron Thorns, if you went second, even if you weren't able to get the attack off, you just put it in the active, right? And then you can kind of, usually by a turn, they need so much, they would need like something like a boss's orders as well with their double Archeops play, and they can't even Lumineon for the boss's orders. So it ends up buying you at least a turn a lot of the times, and so it was really strong for that. And it was kind of just like, well, if we play this, we don't need to play Raikou, so we weren't even losing spaces in the deck really. Like Raikou became the Iron Thorns, and then we took the Forest Seal Stone slot and made an extra Pokestop. So it kind of just was even trade to overall improve the Lugia matchup. It can still kill stuff like Pidgeot, and it occasionally has uses in other matchups as well. Like I used it against a Chien Pao one time. I started it against him, against Lucas Sting, and then he wasn't able to get to the turn 2 attack because of that. So it can slow down other decks too, and it's just it's a pretty interesting card to have in your deck and something that your opponents kind of have to worry about. And overall, it was much more useful than something like the Raikou, I think.
Okay, fair. And the last few cards I want to ask you are from like what's it called? From like, this is the list that Pedro ended up running at the event. Obviously, you know, other Lost Zone player, and this sort of was like, honestly, the insert in terms of at the very least text, basically the opposite of what you went with, you in literally every way. And the few differences here that he ran that like are possible inclusions in the deck are the Artisan, definitely the Counter Catcher, and the Spiritomb, like the 3 main ones, and then obviously the Roaring Moon, but we already talked about that. So yeah, what do you think of a list like this? Like advantages, disadvantages, are there situations where you would run something close to this?
Yeah, so I would say my biggest like issue with Pedro's list is that he plays the Artisan instead of Pokestop. I think Pokestop's like the best card in the deck. Whenever I've had success with Lost Box list, usually the better I've done is when I played more Pokestop. And I think it just gives you so much more ability to kind of make these huge plays instead of having to go a little bit slower. And also in the end game, it means when your deck's a lot of items, they're just kind of protected and you don't end up lost zoning them. So just overall, I think the Pokestops are so much better than Artisans. But a lot of his other cards, I think, do have some merit. Something like the Roaring Moon, obviously we talked about that earlier. Having access to take out big threats, especially if Jirachi becomes a bigger part of the meta again. And something like the Spiritomb is kind of the other way to answer Lugia, right? He's still playing the Raikou, but then he has the Spiritomb, which turns off the Lumineon, which can definitely be a big problem for them. Getting to the turn 2 attack if they don't have access to the Lumineon, especially if you went first as Lost Box and put down the Spiritomb, there's a chance their hand would just be unplayable. Or if they didn't expect it and didn't bench the Lumineon on turn 1. So I definitely think there's some merit to that, although it kind of saves some spaces to combine the Raikou and the Spiritomb into just something like the Iron Thorns, and then you kind of get an extra space from there and even a second taking extra space when you cut the Forest Seal Stone. So overall, I think my deck like utilizes the space a little bit better to increase your way to play Turbo, have more options for that. But Pedro's list does have probably more options overall in terms of the different attackers and plays that he can make. So it kind of depends what you value. I value being able to go fast because that's when I've typically seen success for the deck before.
Okay, fair enough. I think that makes a lot of sense. Last card, Countercatcher. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I didn't in my list I wasn't a huge fan of it. I think it makes more sense in something like Pedro's list, where my list a lot of times the idea was that you would take a lead early and put a lot of pressure on them. So Countercatcher isn't even a live card a lot of the times. You're either tied or ahead, and then you're kind of trying to close out the game at the end, and like maybe when you're tied on prizes at the end. And then so it's not a super useful card for that. But in something like Pedro's list where it's a little bit slower, you're probably gonna have more chances to use it. So I think it makes a lot more sense in that kind of deck. But I would say in my deck, you do have to be very careful with when you use your Prime Catcher because you don't have something like the Counter Catcher, and you can't always draw into the boss at the end of the game when you need to. So ideally, you're saving your Prime Catcher toward the end of the game to where you can close out the game for you.
Fair enough. And the last card that I actually wanted to talk about, that some people were running, was definitely less common. Was the Hassle. You know, look at top 8, get 3. What do you think about Hassle?
So I think similar to my kind of issue with Counter Catcher is that my deck's trying to go fast and get ahead initially. So a lot of times the most important chorus for my deck is having the one at the beginning of the game, which kind of means that having Hassle doesn't actually help you at the beginning of the game, right? Because you have to have your opponent take a knockout first. And I feel like once I get going, once I play that first chorus, use some Pokestops, my deck actually functions pretty well after that. The deck starts to get a little bit thinner. You have Power Pad to put more choruses back into the deck. So I felt like the biggest issue with my deck was actually finding the chorus at the beginning of the game. And so I didn't really think that Hassle was going to fix that issue where I wanted to try to put on pressure at the beginning. So I felt like something like the Pokegear is more useful than the Hassle. You could argue for it over the Roxanne, but again, I was scared to not have Roxanne in the deck in case I got late in the tournament and my opponent knew I didn't have it. I think that kind of like in finals too, in game 1, I didn't end up playing the Roxanne, but if he would have known I didn't have it, and then he wouldn't have Iono'd me, he would have had all the cards he needed in his hand to win, and I wouldn't have been able to win that game. So just stuff like that, being able to threaten the Roxanne is very useful.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. So I think that, that's all I have in terms of deck list. So we're going to move straight on to the sort of matchups, and we're going to start with what you're going first and second against. So I think the best place to start is what you're going blind first or second in the format at the moment.
Yeah, so I would choose blind first because that is so huge against stuff like Gardevoir and Lugia, which are two of the most popular decks. And most of there are a lot of matchups you'd prefer to go second in, but overall those matchups don't hurt you as much going second or going first as going second against stuff like Gardevoir and Lugia, which is significantly worse to play out those matchups.
It's actually interesting because it's the exact same logic we had for Gardevoir. It's like less matchups, but it's more important, Lugia and stuff. Yeah, okay. And then what are those matchups that you're going second against? Specifically, so we have a list of matchups here, like Zard, Lost, Dragapult, Raging Bolt, Storm, Miraidon, and then obviously Lugia, Gardevoir. If you can sort of list off the matchups that you're going first versus second, that'd be great.
So against Gardevoir, like I said, I'd go first. Same with the Lugia. You really want to go first to be able to threaten those turn 2 type of plays against them, either with the Iron Thorns against Lugia potentially, or the Iron Hands against Gardevoir. But against something like Raging Bolt, you definitely want to choose second. Their deck can't do too much going first, and it kind of just buys you an extra turn of chorus potentially to get to the response type of plays. Dragapult was one that I decided you would rather go second against. It's pretty difficult for their deck to get to turn 2 attack if they go first. They're a lot of times reliant on stuff like the Arven to set up their board with Buddy Poffins. And I find when I go second against them, a lot of times they don't set up at all, and just an early cram that they can't respond to can put on a lot of pressure that you need to end up winning that matchup. In Mirror, I decided that second was slightly better, but it's not a huge deal, I don't think. But overall, being able to get the first cram attack kind of helps the price rate. It's very hard to go something like 2/2/2 in Lost Box Mirror, even without the mana fee, if they're limiting their board right. So if you go first, you're kind of forced to, you're kind of end up being a turn behind because you really can't do the 2/2/2 price rate if they don't let you. So taking the extra one with cram is fairly useful if you're able to do that first. Something like the Miraidon, same with the Raging Bolt logic, you'd rather go second, just to have an extra turn to set up your board before they start pressuring you with the Chorus's Experiment. Against Charizard, that one was a little bit tougher of a matchup to decide first or second. That's the one I'm most unsure on still. I think if they play Jirachi, you'd probably rather go second because you kind of just need to pressure them a lot more if they have the Jirachi, because if they get the full setup, it's very hard for you to beat them because of their ability to shut down Sableye and the fact that we don't have Roaring Moon. If they don't have Jirachi, it's a lot more interesting. If you go first, you can potentially get to the turn 2 Sableye play and just completely destroy their board. And Charizard doesn't need quite as much on turn 1 as something like the Dragapult, so they can sometimes realistically get set up going first. I think I would probably go second against them overall, but it's definitely pretty close. The one I hit at NAIC, I think he got to choose both games. I think he won, or maybe I got to choose game one when it was blind, and then I won game one and he chose game two. So I never actually had to choose knowing the matchup in against him at NAIC.
And then like Stall and Chien Pao, I think are the two you didn't hit.
So Chien Pao, you definitely want to go first. It gives you easier access to get to the turn 2 Greninja before they set up. They don't really play Manaphy. And just taking the first 2 prizes in that matchup is basically decides the game most of the time. So you'd much rather go first. Stall is, I think you choose second against them. I didn't hit any at the tournament, and it's not a super common deck, but overall their deck definitely benefits a lot more from going second. So I would be choosing second against them.
Okay, cool. Perfect. Makes sense. Yep. So we're going to get straight into matchups, and the first matchup we're going to talk about is the Gardevoir matchup. There's definitely a lot of ways this matchup can go. But something Kaiwan actually said directly to me after the game he played against you was he didn't give me a single chance to attack with Flutter Mane the entire set. So what do you think about that? How are you actually like making it so they can't attack with Flutter Mane? Because that seems like, definitely one of the pain points of the matchup. I think after we won't talk about what happens when you're sort of like in a brutal spot with Klefki, but it's all about when the matchup goes like more normal. You get like some setup, maybe not the perfect setup. How you like, what are you attacking with in the early game, and then how are you making chances from there? Yeah.
So playing around Flutter Mane is one of the most important parts of the matchup. And if they don't have something like the Klefki, then usually Iron Bundle is a very good answer to the Flutter Mane, because if you use it, it forces it to the bench, and then you would just get your abilities back anyway. And so against Kaiwan, I was constantly trying to keep the Iron Bundle on the board. Or another way to kind of keep it on the board, like theoretically, is if they have an Artisan in play. They can't ever get rid of that. And so if you just super rod your Iron Bundle back, even if it's not on the board, as long as you have a bench space open, you can always go Artisan for Iron Bundle, which I think is something I did against him in one of our games as well. I just kind of had the option to threaten it. So like Iron Bundle is definitely the huge point of playing around the Flutter Mane. I'd say the other thing is you don't always want to go in for the early Cramorant attack, because then you are very weak to a Flutter Mane plus the Unfair Stamp on turn 2, where you kind of end up just getting completely shut down. I do think if you have access to the Iron Bundle on the board and have a Pokestop in play, which is not super easy for them to bump, it is like okay to go in for the Cramorant if you think that will put a lot of pressure on them, because even if they do pull off the Unfair Stamp Flutter Mane play, you still do have access to using Pokestop to get some items and Iron Bundle to get access to your comfies. So I think sometimes it can be okay if you have the Pokestop in play and the Iron Bundle on board, but otherwise I would say even still be careful about it, and if you don't, you definitely just want to build up for the Iron Hands turn 2, which is something that they can't attack with Flutter Mane into, and it puts a lot more pressure onto them where it can just keep taking prizes over and over again.
Okay, go straight for Iron Hands. Yeah, and like sort of when you're in this like situation where you're getting, I think we can definitely talk about the late game after this as well, but when you're sort of getting Klefki locked, how do you sort of, I don't know, what is sort of your plans to get out of it? I mean, a lot of the time you don't have a lot of flexibility, but like where are you trying to get manual attachments to? Like what does that sort of look like for you?
Yeah, so I was definitely hoping to not hit too many Klefkis throughout the tournament, but I did hit one in the finals of the event, and it definitely makes your matchup a lot more awkward. I think if they don't have the Klefki, I would say it's a favored matchup, but with a Klefki, it's a lot harder. But you can definitely still pull off wins. In testing, it was feeling pretty close. I would say you ideally open like a pretty good hand with something like a chorus in it, to where you can get around that. You have Prime Catcher and Boss's Orders to get around it as well. And if you just have access to using the Pokestop every turn, if you can get a few cards in the Lost Zone, you can also vacuum away your Pokestops and sometimes get to 7. So your goal is to figure out a way to get to 7, or to manually power up an attacker, something like the Greninja if you have access to a lot of water energies, or if you don't, you can try to manually power up the Iron Hand. But it's definitely really hard if you don't have access to any choruses or gust cards in your opening hand to get around the Klefki.
Yeah, and I think the main point with that is like if they're Klefki spamming, obviously you just get Greninja like to snipe. So yeah, definitely agree with that. And then after you sort of like get out of the like early game, like let's say you've gone for Iron Hands, what are sort of the ways that you've done, like obviously like transitioning to like Sableye and trying to do stuff like that to like make the late game like as easy as possible? Sort of what do you think about that?
So I think, one of the big things is keeping a stadium in play. You ideally don't want to leave yourself with a vacuum, like vacuuming your stadium. Sometimes you have to, but if you can keep one in play, that's really good, because either that means you'll get access to Pokestop, which when your deck has a lot of items, it could be finding you Nest Balls, Super Rods, Mirage Gates to keep using the Sableye over and over again. Or if they bump it, most of them don't play Temple, most of them just play Enhanced Hammer. Stefan did play the Temple, I think, but most of them just play a couple of Artisans as their stadiums. So then even if they do bump it, that still has a way to search out Sableye, which is extremely useful if they give you the Artisan. So either way, as long as you leave your stadium in play, usually it gives you extra outs to find the Sableye, either with Pokestop or with Artisan, which is something that's really useful in that matchup. And additionally, just trying to thin out your deck as much as you can. a lot of times at the end of the game, your deck can become almost only Nest Balls, Mirage Gates, Super Rods, Colruses, stuff like that, thanks to the Pokestop thinning out to other bad cards throughout the game. And then it makes it extremely easy to keep using the Sableye over and over again. I think if you can get to the end game board state against Gardevoir, with my deck, it ends up being very strong with all the turbo cards I have.
Cool, makes a lot of sense. I don't really think I have much ball for that matchup, to be honest. I think it's mainly just like, you know, the Iron Hands. Hope you can hit like Iron Hands as soon as possible and then go into everything else. And that's sort of what it sounded like from what you said. Cool. Yeah, so the next matchup I want to talk about is Lugia. You did obviously play the Iron Thorns at this event. But sort of what does this matchup look like in general? Even if, you know, I mean, there's obviously the games where you fully lock them out with Iron Thorns, but what does this matchup generally look like? How do you get prizes and stuff?
Yeah, so I did hit 2 Lugias in the tournament, and one of them even did have the Flutter Mane, but I was able to beat both of them. Definitely a closer set against the Flutter Mane, though. If they don't have any access to move the Iron Thorns, usually you can take your first 3 prizes with the Iron Thorns, and then you kind of try to set up prizes in the end game with potentially an Iron Hands for multiple prizes, type of knockouts. A lot of times your stuff like Sableye isn't too useful because they have Mist Energy on all their Pokemon. But if they don't have Mist Energy on things, sometimes you can take prizes with that as well. Your prizes in the end game actually do end up getting fairly awkward with the deck because of stuff like the Mist Energy, their high HP Pokemon, and they have access to the Legacy Energy potentially too, to force your prize trade a little bit awkward. You do have to be really careful. A lot of times you end up having to close out with something like an Iron Hands for 2 or 3 prizes on something like a Luminion or a Lugia or like an Archeops for the last 2. So you do have to be very careful with your resources because you end up having to use a lot of the Mirage Gate attackers in this matchup, which is kind of why Iron Thorns is really useful as well, because a lot of times they end up don't having response to it for another turn, or they have to boss around it, and then when they boss around it, your Iron Thorns doesn't die, so you end up keeping the energy on that, which gives you another attacker for another turn. So the Iron Thorns definitely helps the matchup with the energy trade a lot as well, or just being able to have enough attackers to close it out. But you do have to be very careful with your attackers, since it's not a matchup you can end the game with stuff like the Cramorant and the Sableye. But again, when they have the Flutter Mane, it definitely gets a lot closer. The one I hit with a Flutter Mane, one game the Flutter Mane was able to turn off my Tyranitar, or I guess turn off the Iron Thorns.
Yeah.
And it also made it so I couldn't use my Comfies at that point when he started attacking with it. So that's definitely pretty scary when they have the Flutter Mane, but it's definitely something you can deal with as well. You do have the Iron Bundle if they try to use it to lock you out of the game. And you still can put a lot of pressure on them. It takes a lot for them to get the turn 2 Summoning Star, because they also need access to find the Flutter Mane and get into the active now, just to be able to get off their Summoning Star. So it's definitely still a fine matchup, but it's a lot scarier when they have access to the tech card.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of like if they're using like Iron Hands, do you have any do you ever go like around the Iron Hands, or you just have to go straight on with not Ogerpon, what's it called, Ursaluna? Yeah, what do you think about dealing with Iron Hands?
So yeah, if they get an early game Iron Hands off before you attack, you're probably in trouble. You can if they're able to boss around your Iron Thorns, use their Iron Hands before you take any prizes. That is definitely a pretty tough position. You can try. I think at that point you kind of have to respond to it with Ursaluna, since they're ahead in the prize trade, and hope that they don't have access to a Cincino. Potentially they don't have enough room on their bench to get a Cincino set up, and then you could still be fine. But definitely pretty scary. But I'm assuming you were able to take the first prizes and then they use Iron Hands, and you're ahead in the prize trade. At that point, you kind of have to go around it. Iron Hand stuff on the bench, or like taking more knockouts with Iron Thorns. So I would say you kind of have to see what the game situation is. If you can win the prize trade going around it, usually that's what you end up having to do. But if you can't, if they got it off super early, then you kind of have to kill with an Ursaluna and hope they can't respond.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I think that's mainly what I have for this matchup. I don't think I really have any more questions for this one specifically. Yeah, so let's move on to the next one. Raging Bolt. Definitely a newer matchup, hasn't been around for very long. What do you think about this matchup? How good do you think it is? And then what do you think you do in it?
Yeah, so this matchup actually has 2 different ways it can kind of play out. I would say this matchup's overall favored, but it can definitely be pretty scary. They put a lot of pressure on you, which I would say most decks probably feel the same way about the matchup generally.
Yeah.
So the first route is if they take a prize and you were able to set up your board enough, and then you're able to do a double Mirage Gate play to your Ursaluna, potentially with a Lost Vacuum if they have a Bravery Charm or an Ancient Booster Capsule, then you can knock out their Raging Bolt. And at that point, the game's probably over for them because they can knock out your Ursaluna, but then you can just set it back up with 1 Mirage Gate, and then if they knock it out again, you just set it up for free, basically. So at that point, you kind of win the game, but you can't always get to that play turn 2 as well. So you have another play with attacking with 1 prizers, where you can use Cramorant and Radiant Greninja and Sableye. Sometimes you have to use 2 Radiant Greninjas on their Raging Bolts, or like a Squawkabilly and a Raging Bolt. You have to do the math, you have to be aware of switch cards, but it does actually work out, assuming they don't play Penny, which isn't super common, but some of them do play it. So it's definitely the less ideal route, but if you are unable to get to the Ursaluna turn 2, if they take the first prize. You do have access to like Cramorant the active, Radiant Greninja, and then potentially Radiant Greninja again if it's 2 Raging Bolts, but if they bench Squawk for you, then it's just Cramorant, Radiant Greninja, the Raging Bolt, Squawk, and then 2 Sableye should be enough to do enough damage, and then you can close out the game with an Ursaluna for your last 2 prizes when they go to 1 prize. So that's kind of the other route to win the matchup. Definitely a little bit more complicated, and so it's more ideal to just do the Ursaluna knockout, their Raging Bolt with 2 Mirage Gates to start with if you can get to that play.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually remember talking with Hegster about that. Yeah, definitely very cool playing the matchup. I don't actually, and then they sort of play Iono sometimes. Yeah, it's like the Super to get the Ursaluna. I don't actually think there is much to talk about in that matchup. So I think we're gonna move on straight away to the Zard matchup. You definitely talked about this a lot in we talked about the deck list and talked about Roaring Moon and stuff. Yeah, how do you think this matchup goes for the most part? You said like you had games where you just hit turn 2 Sableye and destroy them, but yeah, what does sort of a more normal game look like?
Yeah, so like assuming they don't have Jirachi, or like what they
assuming they don't have Jirachi. I don't even think Jirachi from the list we've seen from the next format were very common.
Yeah, it wasn't very common at NAIC, but I wasn't sure if it might go up or not. But assuming they don't, you kind of want to take the first prize with Cramorant if you can to put a little bit of pressure on them. But at that point, you kind of have to play it by how the game goes. Ideally, at that point, if they had to do something like the Arvan to set up their board more, then it kind of puts them in a spot where your hand is really big, and you can potentially go boss knockout the Pidgeot, go to 3, and that puts a lot of pressure on them to where even if they respond to you, you kind of now have access to Sableye to set up damage to win the game, because they would just be getting to 3-3. And now if you don't have Jirachi, you kind of have unlimited access to Sableye, right, on their little things on the bench. So a lot of times that end up being a pretty good route if you can go into it. But a lot of times you don't have access to that either, especially if they got it off an Iono. And then you kind of have to take it a little bit slower, potentially use some Sableyes earlier to pick off some things on the bench. I would say overall it feels like a pretty good matchup, but it's pretty interesting to play because it depends a lot on what they do, what their board looks like, what cards you draw and do. It's definitely not as straightforward as some of the other matchups, but and ideally you don't want to bench too many 2 prizes in this matchup, right? You kind of only want to bench them when you're using them, right? Stuff like don't bench your Iron Hands just at the beginning of the game, right? Because then it kind of just gives them free prizes potentially. And if you force them to go through a lot of 1 prizers, especially if you have access to the Sableye, which can kind of be even trading or positively trading if it gets multiple uses on small HP things, then you kind of end up winning the prize trade that way. So I would say don't give them too many 2 prizers and kind of play it by how they play the game. One other interesting line you can do, but I don't really like it too much, is the use of the Iron Thorns in this matchup. It can kind of shut them down if you go in with an early Iron Thorns, right? It turns off their Pidgeot, turns off their Charizard, but they can kind of counter catcher around it and then use their abilities, and then you end up with a 2 prize liability on your board that doesn't do too much. But I guess if they counter catcher around it and then you're able to kill the Pidgeot next turn with it if they set it up, that's like an okay play, right? Because then you're actually getting value out of it. But overall, I would say it's better to just go for the 1 prize routes in this match.
Okay, fair. Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought about using Iron Thorns in this one for sure. It's actually interesting because I wouldn't have said that this matchup is favored. Like when I was talking to people about Lost Box, this is probably one of the matchups I would have been more scared of.
Okay. I think if they don't have Jirachi, it's favored. It's like fairly close, but I don't know. I like playing against it. I was fine playing against the one.
Okay, fair, interesting. And if you want to briefly run over what the matchup sort of looks like if they have Jirachi, what do you think about it?
Yeah, so I was theoring this a lot yesterday actually. So if they have the Jirachi, you definitely still want to go second. It's even better to go second, put on a lot of pressure on them with the Cramorant, and then assuming they get the full setup, right? They get the Jirachi, they get the Manaphy, they get everything out turn 2. Then you're kind of in an interesting spot where it's very hard to take enough knockouts to win the game. It definitely depends on what they do. I think Iron Bundling around their Charizard potentially for prizes can be pretty useful. Like using an Iron Bundle on turn 2, if they have a Charizard in the active and then a bunch of 1 prizers and a Pidgeot on the bench, kind of gives you an interesting line where they either have to send out, like they probably have to send up a 1 prizer that you can just take another knockout with Cram on it to stay ahead in the prize trade. Or if this, like obviously if they send up Pidgeot, then you would just be able to take a knockout on it with Iron Thorns. So I think that seems like a pretty good play to get to 4. And then from there, they start setting up their board a little bit more. You probably have to Gust kill Pidgeot at some point. And then you can kind of try to 2-shot a Charizard with something like Cramorant and Ursaluna. If you've knocked out the Pidgeot, it's going to be harder for them to find those access to those Turo candy plays, especially if you combine it with Roxanne. And then one other interesting attacker that you could potentially use in the matchup would be something like the Iron Bundle. I guess I should have probably mentioned this earlier too. Like, so if you knock out their Pidgeot and you're using stuff like Roxanne, Iron Bundle can actually be pretty annoying for decks to deal with if you use it to attack into them. So because it turns off Evolution's attacking, it's definitely more useful against Dragapult, so I imagine we'll talk about that later. Yeah. And Charizard also has 330, so it doesn't do enough to set it up quite for the Ursaluna if you aren't using Sableye. So it probably goes more with the, if you have access to Sableye, if you put 10 on the Charizard earlier, and then you go with a attack with the Iron Bundle. It will definitely force an awkward plays out of them where maybe they can't do everything they want that turn, and then you have easy access to using the Ursaluna to close out the game. Obviously countered by Turo as well, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind against evolution decks that you can attack with Iron Bundle.
And I guess even if like they use Turo, like they have to find the other Zard as well, like you can definitely make things a lot
If you've knocked out the
harder.
Pidgeot and you use Roxanne, it can be really hard for them to find all the pieces they need to use to do the Turo play.
And it does block the it does block the Iron-O a little bit, which I guess can be helpful as well. If you're forcing them to do that. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think that sort of mostly covers it for the matchup. Is this with the you know, like Iron Bundling around Zard thing, is that something that you're like actually prioritizing, like getting Iron Bundle onto the board? Because like I've from playing this deck a little bit, like you don't get to choose what Pokemon unless you like specifically go for it. Are you ever actually like benching Iron Bundle earlier so the Iron-Os are easier, or sort of what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, I don't exactly. I mean, again, the one I played against I didn't really test against ones with Jirachi because I didn't expect to hit very much of them. I think that's like one of those things where it's just you have to take advantage of the small HP like 1-for-1 trades at the beginning of the game when you can, and you ideally don't want to be wasting your stuff like your boss's orders or your prime catcher to do it when they have the thing like the Jirachi in play. So I think that that's a pretty big play you can go for. Obviously, you have all your nest balls, and it can be really hard for them to get the Iono plays off if they're trying to set up all of these different Pokemon, get their Jirachi down, get their Manaphy down, get their Pidgeot, get their Charizard into play. So I think overall, it's definitely like you a lot of times will end up with a lot of cards in your hand, and then just you'll have access to the Iron Bundle Cramorant play potentially to take another prize. And then it gets to the 4-4 board state where you can kill Pidgeot and potentially 2-shot a Charizard, or kill Pidgeot and then Iron Hands a 2-prizer to win the game. So definitely just not having to waste your Gust card while getting to 4 prizes can be pretty useful in that matchup. But also killing Pidgeot can be useful, so I think that could be definitely dependent on the game. It might be better to boss kill the Pidgeot sometimes than use an Iron Bundle.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next matchup. You just talked about it. We'll move straight on to the Dragapult matchup. It's definitely two versions of Dragapult at the moment. The Lost Zone, and then I think sort of the everything else is sort of pretty similar with either like Charizard, all of them playing like a Pidgeot line. We can just start off with like a Lost Zone Dragapult version. Like how does this sort of play out in general?
Yeah, so the Lost Zone Dragapult matchup is pretty interesting. I hit one of them at the tournament and I actually lost to it. It can be pretty scary, right? They have access to the early pressure with Cramorant, and they can also set up their Dragapult in the late game, especially with Mirage Gate, so even if they don't have energies in play, they can still threaten getting those Dragapults off. But their deck's not super consistent. I think I might have overestimated their deck a little bit playing against it, and I think sometimes just even pressuring with Cramorant, stuff like the Sableye on their Dracoloaks, and especially with the Roxanne at the end of the game too, can be pretty hard for them to deal with when they don't have a great engine on board. And so I think overall the matchup's definitely fine, and I would just try to pressure early with Cramorant. You can also go into Iron Hands, which is pretty hard for them to deal with. They do have Radiant Charizard, but their deck's not super fast, and it's not always going to be super easy to get a Radiant Charizard on turn 2.
Yeah, I would say the scariest thing is definitely has felt like for me the Iron Hands from playing a little bit of Lost Zone Pult. It's really, really difficult to deal with. They do play Unfair Stamp, and are you thinking about sort of playing around Unfair Stamp in a matchup like this?
So it's definitely something you have to consider a little bit, but unlike the decks like Gardevoir, decks like Charizard that can actually search out their Unfair Stamp, a lot of times like Dragapult doesn't have any real way to find it, right? Like, I mean, the Lost Dragapult doesn't have any real way to find it. So it's not super easy for them to get to that. I mean, you definitely have to consider a little bit, like they could get to it and play around it a little bit, but I would say still being aggressive, right, with whatever attack you get to, right? You definitely still want to use turn 1 Cramorant to pressure them, and then they might get Unfair Stamp, but you can maybe even still recover off of it too, right? It's not like they're putting a Flutter Mane in the active, so you still have access to using your Comfies to find any cards you need off of that. So I would say you're definitely a little bit less scared of Unfair Stamp in this matchup, but it's something to keep in mind.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I think that all makes a lot of sense. And then moving now to the sort of Pidgeot Dragapult, or like Zard. I mean, the Tor deck is basically just a Zard deck, but even more like a Pidgeot Dragapult deck. They're definitely wanting to use Dragapult against you if possible. How do you think that these sort of, what do you think about, honestly, the matchups? I'm interested if you think this is like a fine matchup or not so fine. And then how do you sort of play it?
So like the Tord version of the deck or like the regular Pidgeot
Well,
Dragapult version?
I think just like a normal Dragapult, a deck that can actually attack with Dragapult relatively early, I think is the most interesting to talk about.
Yeah, so you have a couple of different lines against that deck. I think that if you can get to turn 2 Sableye, a lot of times that can put on so much pressure, right? Knocking out their Dreepies with energies. And a lot of times, or can knock out their Pidgey potentially as well, whichever you think is more devastating to their board. So that's a matchup you really want to get to Sableye extremely quickly, right? They're never going to have access to Jirachi, or if they don't have Manaphy, or they weren't able to get it down, Greninja can also be pretty strong in that matchup. Greninja is just something I guess in every matchup I haven't really been mentioning, but if they don't bench Manaphy, it's usually pretty good. So
Yeah.
force your opponents to bench Manaphy. But like outside of that, turn 2 Sableye can be really good. I don't really like going for turn 2 Iron Hands because then if it looks like they can respond, because then if they go Defiance Band Knockout, you usually just lose. One thing that's interesting is if you don't bench 2 prizers, it takes them 4 attacks to win every game, right? They just can't do enough damage. If you don't bench 2 prizers for the majority of the game, right, you can bench like a Ursaluna at the end of the game. That is 260. They're not really winning an extra turns off of that. That's too much HP. But if you bench something like the Iron Hands early and they knock it out, it actually only takes them 2 more attacks to win. So a lot of times if you go second into Dragapult, it's gonna be not very easy for them to get the setup that they need. And then even if you just go in with a Cramorant, right, it's not going to be very easy for them to respond turn 2, and then you use another Cramorant or Sableye, you're at 4 prizes, you've started setting up their board, and it still takes them 4 attacks to win from this point, which is actually a lot. And then even just using Sableye's, you have the Iron Bundle attack into Dragapult, potentially into Ursaluna knockout is another way to take prizes, or just get damage on the Dragapult with Sableye, knock it out with Ursaluna. So overall, if you just use your 1 prizers and pressure them and they're not able to respond turn 2, which a lot of times if they go first, they won't be able to, because their deck's really reliant on stuff like the Arven, you can end up just putting on a lot of pressure and taking enough prizes early to where you can close out the game at the end with your attackers. So I would say you definitely don't always want to go into just like an Iron Hands turn 2 type of play.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. That's not something that I really thought about personally for this matchup. And then yeah, do you think this looks different for like a Tord version, like where they're probably attacking with Zard first and then going into Pult later? That change much of what you do?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about the matchup right now. I'm looking at his list. I think that it's probably not too different.
Mhm.
I mean, I definitely would still not be using Iron Hands turn 2 against a Charizard deck either, really.
Yeah.
That's a lot of commitment and it's going to get knocked out. So I think you definitely, I would still just be trying to get to the early Cramorant to put pressure on if I'm going second, or Sableye as fast as I can if I'm going first, right? Potentially get to the turn 2 Sableye. With stuff like with the 3 Lost Vacuums, using a bunch of Compies, using Chorus, you can definitely get to that play somewhat reasonably, and that puts a lot of pressure on them, right? You can potentially knock out Charmander and Pidgey, or Dreepy and Pidgey. Obviously depends on like the HP of the ones that they play, or knock out like a Bidoof as well and a Pidgey. So overall, getting to Sableye really early is really good against their deck. You just want to put on pressure overall, and then kind of save your 2 prizers for the end, because it definitely makes their prize trade worse when they have to deal with all 1 prizers instead.
Yeah, I think the core difference is like a sort of a full Pidgeot version has to run Neo Upper, while Tord's deck is running Unfair Stamp. And I know his plan was definitely to just Unfair Stamp in the face of Cramorant turn 2. So maybe like do you think that changes anything?
I mean, I don't think you can just pass against. I don't think it's
Yeah.
like against Gardevoir, you can kind of take a little bit of time off, get to the Iron Hands, and you're still in like a fine spot to win. But against this deck, you really can't just be passing and letting them have turns to set up. So you do have to put pressure on them, right? It's not super easy for them to get the full set they want and find like the Unfair Stamp, find everything that they need. As well as my deck has a decent amount of recovery off of something like an Unfair Stamp, especially if you like bench Sableye ahead of time, right? You get some cards in the Lost Zone, and you keep a Pokestop in play. That's another thing they need to try to get rid of that can give you more cards. I don't think my deck's quite as scared of Unfair Stamp generally as other Lost Box decks. It's much more scary when your opponent has something like a Flutter Mane to put in the active against Gardevoir.
Yep.
But against other decks, you can definitely recover off it, or even just if they Unfair Stamp you and they knock out your Cramorant, even if you just Cramorant again or bundle Cramorant, that still is a fine spot to put in the game, and you can kind of recover off of that.
Okay, fair. I think that makes sense, and you covered most things for that matchup. Next matchup I think that we should talk about is just the Lost Mirror. So this matchup's obviously been around for ages. But now we have Ursaluna, which I think changes things a bit. Yeah, how do you generally think this matchup plays out start to finish?
Yeah, so this matchup is like really interesting now. I think it's way more interesting than it used to be, like even like back because I haven't played Lost Box too much recently, but like I played it like a year ago, and at that point it was just kind of like getting to Sableye, using Sableye over and over again, potentially trying to board lock your opponent out of Sableye. It was basically completely revolved around Sableye, and now it really doesn't anymore. You have access to these extra prize attackers like Iron Hands, which is definitely something interesting. But if you use an Iron Hands early, your opponent can respond with an Ursaluna, and then that's something that decks really can't deal with. If you're playing the Roaring Moon version, you can potentially knock that out, but then you are leaving yourself open to getting Sableye for 3 prizes too. So that's not even a great response to Ursaluna in general. So the matchup's definitely like I think more interesting now. I would say taking the first prize with Cramorant going second is an advantage a little bit like we talked about earlier, because going 2-2-2 is very difficult. So getting the first prize with Cramorant, then potentially setting up knockouts with Sableye later, into going in with stuff like Iron Hands at the end of the game, more near the end of the game. I would say making sure you play around Roxanne is a huge part of the thing. So potentially getting to 4 prizes and then like using Sableye a little bit, or like using Cramorant, taking a prize with Sableye while setting up other damage, and then trying to make it so that when you go into Roxanne range, you kind of thin out your deck a little bit and you have a way to win the game next turn. So it puts a lot of pressure on your opponent to where sure they can Roxanne you, but if you have good odds to be able to close out the game in the very next turn, that's not a huge thing. But a lot of times if you can't do that, you want to make sure you're not going into Roxanne range. You don't want to be the first one to go into it if you don't have a good way to close out the game on the next turn.
Mm-hmm. So how do you make it so you actually have a way to win, an easy way to win on the final turn? Like, what are your sort of conditions for having an easy way to win on the final turn?
So obviously, like, it depends what your opponent's like doing, and sometimes it gets a little bit harder depending on what they're trying to do. But a lot of times, like, say they have a 2-prizer on their board that you could you could kill with an Ursaluna at the end of the game, right? You make it so all you need to find is like a boss's orders or a prime catcher when you've got your deck fairly low and you have a lot of dig power. That can be fairly decent. Or if you can set it to where you just need a Sableye to close out the game, right? That is another easier way to win. You definitely kind of have to play it by what your opponent gives you and like what cards they have access to, right? If they have enough switch cards to heal out of Sableye damage, right? If they have a 2-prizer on the board to finish off with Ursaluna. But ideally, you're just trying to make it as easy as possible based on what your opponent gives you. It definitely depends on the game, but I would say usually you don't want to go in with an early Iron Hands because you're going to get Ursaluna. You definitely have to play it a little bit more safe than that.
Okay. And I would assume also Ursaluna is probably like pretty safe on the bench as well, right?
Yeah, generally, yes. There is like some interesting plays where like they could say Gust Ursaluna and hit with their Ursaluna and then Sableye for 3 prizes if that was like something that helped their prize map. And that it could also be interesting to where that doesn't force them to go into Roxanne range while they still get a ton of damage on your board by hitting it for 240. Mm-hmm. So but if you're benching at the end of the game, right, it's not going to be very easy for them to knock it out if they don't play something like the Roaring Moon. They really can't kill it in 1 turn. So like benching it when you go into Roxanne range, you know you're going to have at least 1 turn for it to be able to live and finish off the game if you need it to.
Okay, cool. So benching like Ursaluna late on can be good, but yeah, probably not turn 2. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I don't think there is really much else to say for this matchup that I can think of. Yeah, so I think you should move on to the next matchup, which is going to be Chien Pao. You alluded to earlier that you think this is a pretty good matchup. What do you think you're sort of doing in this matchup? Like, obviously you kind of both have a pretty strong Greninja. But yeah, what do you think that actually looks like?
Yeah, so I think this is a pretty decent matchup because you have a bunch of different lines to win, right? Obviously, you'd rather go first, and then it kind of lets you get to the turn 2 Greninja play, take the first 2 prizes. And from that point, it's pretty difficult for them to win. But if you aren't able to do that, or your opponent goes first, there's a bunch of different lines you can take, right? So if you're going second, if they only get down 1 Frigibax, you can eventually gust it up with either an Iron Bundle if they didn't have other bench Pokemon, or a Prime Catcher, or even something like Boss's Orders. Not super common because you probably need to get to 4, not super easy. But overall, sometimes they can only get to the 1 Frigibax, and then if you're able to knock that out, you can win that way, or you can even hit turn 1 Greninja. Sure can knock out their things, and you probably win from there as well, as long as you didn't get rid of too many resources. There's also another interesting line going second where you only bench 1 Comfy, and if you say you open multiple choruses in your hand, or you chorus in another chorus, you can a lot of times get away with only using 1 Comfy, and then they don't have a Greninja play for next turn to really get to what they need to do. They can't take 2 prizes, they can only take something like 1, and then you have access to take the lead in the prize trade from there. This is definitely pretty difficult, and you can't always do it. And as well as if they can get to Iron Hands, it doesn't end up working. But a lot of times going first, their board is not strong enough to threaten the turn 2 Iron Hands. And so if you only bench 1 Comfy, don't give them access to the Greninja for 2. A lot of times they can only take 1 prize, and if your hand's strong enough, you can end up winning the prize trade from there. And then I guess the one other route you have to win is with Roxanne. If you get behind in the game, you can eventually go with like a Prime Catcher up Baxcalibur, Sableye there, Barrel, Roxanne type of play, and hope that they can't get a response off that. It's not super likely, but it's kind of another like few percents to win the game. And then I would say another like a potential play going second if you don't have any other options is to go into an Iron Thorns, especially if you open it in your opening hand. It can kind of shut down their Greninja, shut down their Shivery Chill, But if they're not expecting it, it could maybe make them miss the turn 2 attack if that's something you end up needing to go for. But they can Iron Bundle around it. So it's not could be super strong, but if it's something they weren't expecting and you didn't have any other plays, it's an option against them as well.
Yeah, like maybe if they board locked out of Iron Bundle, I can imagine there's like potential there, yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be like the only way I can imagine that working. So like, let's say they sort of like can only take the first prize with a Chien Pao and like can't go for like a Greninja for 2 or something. What do you think sort of the game looks like from there?
Yeah, so I think there's that game gets really interesting and it's kind of hard to exactly think about how it would play out. There is like a line where you could potentially go in with your Ursaluna with 2 Mirage Gates to knock out their Chien Pao, but then they would use a Greninja play to take out some prizes on the bench and kind of threaten win in 2 turns. And from there you would need 2 more Mirage Gates on your Iron Hands, which is something that you could definitely reasonably do. You can draw your entire deck, but if you had one prized, or because like they're not disrupting you, so you can probably draw through your entire deck with all your Pokestops by then near like turn 3 or turn 4 when this would actually happen. But it could be an issue if you had to lost on one or you prized one early. So that could be a really interesting scenario. But like if you went with the Ursaluna and then they used Ninja and then if you used Iron Hands, it would be really hard for them to ever respond to that. I guess one kind of counter to that too would be powering up Ursaluna with 2 Mirage Gates and then attaching to Iron Hands on the bench would kind of play around this a little bit too, where you only need 1 more Mirage Gate and an attachment next turn if they use the Greninja. And then obviously if they use 2 prizers to respond to your Ursaluna, you can just use Ursaluna again and it gets more efficient throughout the game. And then I would say if this like isn't a reasonable play, you could also just try to target down their barrel with something like a Sableye and just kind of say a lot of times without the barrel Chien Pao it won't be able to function, especially then if you end up using a Roxanne and potentially like another Sableye if they try to set up another barrel near the end of the game. So I would say it can definitely get pretty interesting if it's not one of those clean 2-2-2 games. But you kind of have to play it by how they play it, what cards you have access to, and just keep in mind that the different lines that you have.
Cool. Yeah, I think that was definitely interesting to talk about. All right, so the next matchup we're going to talk about, is Miraidon. This is definitely a matchup as far as I know that Ursaluna gets in a lot, but what do you think? They're definitely very fast with like Iron Hands and all their attackers and stuff. So how do you think this matchup plays out?
Yeah, so this is definitely a matchup that I think is pretty strong. Their deck is very dependent on stuff like the Iron Hands to take the extra prizes, and they really don't have a good way to deal with Ursaluna, especially if you use an Ursaluna and one of your 3 Lost Vacuums to take out their Heavy Baton and then knock out their Iron Hands. It's going to be very hard for them to set up more attackers. So just if you're able to establish a reasonable board with some comfies, like maybe a Greninja, just get enough cards in hand, their deck doesn't have very much of any disruption, and then when they take the first knockout, usually you could respond to that with an Ursaluna, and you're probably in a very good spot to win the game when you use stuff like Lost Vacuums to not take out their tools. And just, even if they got ahead in the game, you could potentially even come back with a Roxanne play, because again, their deck has a very hard time dealing with Ursaluna. So you just, like say they were going to had 3 prizes, and then you Ursaluna them, do a Roxanne, they probably aren't responding that turn, then you take 2 more with Ursaluna, and now you're all the way ahead in the prize trade again to where they can't catch up. So it's definitely a pretty awkward matchup for Miraidon, and I think a very strong matchup for my deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't really seem like they actually have many options there. Yeah, and then like obviously using like the vacuum to get rid of the baton and stuff is like also the stuff that's like very important. But yeah, I think it's actually a super straightforward matchup. Just it's basically attack with Ursaluna whenever you can, and hope that you win. But the last matchup, maybe not as straightforward, is the Storm matchup. Yeah, definitely the last matchup we're going to talk about, but how do you think this one goes? I think we've seen it like a little bit in the last format, and this format maybe not as much. So yeah, what do you think? You've sort of lost to the Roaring Moon that we used to have. So I'm wondering if how that sort of changes things, and what do you think this matchup goes like in general?
So like the Snorlax, not the Pidgeot.
Yeah, Snorlax, right? Not Pidgeot. Yeah, the pure Snorlax.
So this matchup is definitely not great. This is like the one matchup where Spiritomb can help out against.
Yeah,
but I do think you can actually beat the matchup. I tested a little bit like on ladder. I would hit them before the tournament, and I was able to win sometimes. Usually the combination of 2 attackers that I was using in this matchup was Sableye and Iron Hands. And so these are attackers that you should bench as soon as you get access to them to play around stuff like the flute filling up your board, because these are attackers you both really need. Like I really was using both of them when I was able to win games. So you kind of want to, what I was doing is I was just getting a comfy in the active, using it and then not using more switches, just kind of using choruses when I drew them and trying to build up my lost zone. You also have stuff like the Lost Vacuums, but those are very useful to remove their tools. So you have to be careful with those in this matchup as well. And then you kind of try to use a combination of Iron Hands and Sableye. Sableye can set up damage on things to die to amp, as well as Iron Hands can take knockouts right with the amp or arm press on a Snorlax without a tool potentially as well. So, and obviously like so Sableye on multiple targets, right? If they have like a Rotom and a Snorlax, you can set up both of them to die to an amp. And this can be pretty annoying for them as well. If you amp Rotom, that's 3 of your prizes right there. So that can be pretty scary for them. They probably have to, try to penny around that. But so using Stabilize to have damage on multiple targets to die to Iron Hands for multiple prizes is kind of how I was playing it. But it can get pretty difficult if they can target down some of your switches right before you can get enough cards in the Lost Zone, right? They can potentially even go into you to mill you if you got too low in deck when you're getting cards in the Lost Zone. So it's definitely a pretty awkward matchup, but it's not like an unwinnable one if you're be careful with your resource.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that if you play, do you have any experience playing this matchup with Roaring Moon? Do you think it makes it better or changes much?
I did not play with Roaring Moon. I know some of my friends tested the matchup with Roaring Moon, and it still wasn't like a great matchup, right? You can still go 1-for-1 on a lot of their things, but it still has the same issue where while you're trying to build up your Lost Zone, they can target down too many switches with stuff like Eerie and Misfortune Sisters, and it can still get pretty awkward. As well as a lot of times you have to reset up the Roaring Moon, and then that can be pretty hard if they target it on Super Odds and Mirage Gate, because it's either doing only 100 damage or like dying to itself. If you have stadiums, right, that can help, but they have sometimes tools that make it more difficult as well.
And I think I played this matchup a little bit, and the main question like I have is sort of at what point is like your switches for comfies like too many switches, because sometimes they can hit like you can obviously not start comfy and then things and like hit bosses and stuff, that can get really annoying. And you can also sometimes get into a situation where you're too slow, where you feel like you're kind of going too slow. Are you ever like, do you ever feel like there is the situation for just burning switches to do it, or are you like absolutely hard no?
Yeah, so the main time when I would play, I would use switches is like switch into comfy at the beginning and then kind of just sit there until I can actually get to the attacks I want to use. But I think there's an argument where if they're having a little bit slow of a start and you can potentially put on a lot of pressure, it could be worth burning switches to put on pressure. Because again, it's not a great matchup, so you probably want to capitalize if you're in a spot where using those switches can really help you. But I would say if there's not like a specific card that you think you can get that can really turn the game in your favor, you'd probably prefer to keep the switches.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, perfect. I think honestly we covered everything I wanted to cover for Lost Zone. If you want to quickly shout anything out, go ahead.
Yeah, go follow me on Twitter at PokeHawkeye, and shout out to my sponsor, Dead Draw Gaming, and go read my articles on Cutter Tap. I'll have an article up on the deck probably by the time this video is up as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hendrik.